She stepped into the hotel lobby with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged, until they saw her skin. Then came the shift. The warmth vanished. The welcome turned mechanical. Her reservation was suddenly missing. Her ID was questioned twice. A whisper behind the desk sparked a smirk. Seconds later, they were calling security, not because she did anything wrong, but because she didn't fit their idea of who deserves to stand in marble-floored silence. They didn't ask why she was there. They assumed, judged, dismissed, and with each smug glance, they believed they were putting her in her place. What they didn't know was how badly they'd misjudged who was sitting in front of them. This is not a story about attitude. It's not about policy. It's about a room full of people who thought they were untouchable, right up until the moment they found out who they were dealing with. Think you can guess what happens next? Don't just watch. Subscribe, drop a comment, and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you think you've seen injustice, wait until you see how this ends. Lorene Vance stepped out of the town car and into the lobby of the Hayden Grand with a kind of quiet presence that shifted air without sound. Her heels met the polished marble like clockwork, rhythm precise, each stride measured. In her fitted black suit and single-strap leather bag, she looked neither ostentatious nor out of place. She paused for a moment under the glass chandelier, letting the conditioned air wrap around her like a veil before making her way to the check-in line. The lobby smelled of imported lavender, ambition, and money. A concierge in white gloves walked past, nodding at another guest, but not at her. She didn't flinch. She had learned long ago how to move through the world, as though invisible and undeniable at once. There were only 3 people ahead of her. She scanned the check-in desk. 3 receptionists in matching navy uniforms. The middle one, a young blonde with a name tag that read M. Elridge, looked up, caught her eye, and quickly looked away. There was a hesitation, so brief it would vanish in retelling. But Lorene saw it, filed it. 2 guests ahead of her were processed quickly. Room key, smile, voucher for a glass of wine at the rooftop bar. Polite chatter. Then it was her turn. She stepped forward, shoulders back, voice clear. Before she could say a word, M. Elridge smiled brighter now and looked right past her. "Sir, I can help you here." Lorene froze in motion, turned slightly, and saw the man behind her step forward with a surprised grin. Khaki blazer, sunglasses perched on his head, duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He chuckled, not noticing or not caring that he'd just been invited to jump the line. She stepped back without a word, allowed him to pass. The smile from Elridge to him was warm, practiced. A question about his travel day. A mention of their newly renovated spa. She checked him in without once verifying identification. When he left, M. Elridge reset her posture and finally acknowledged Lorene. "Name, please?" Lorene gave it. The woman typed, glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, typed again. "Do you have your ID?" Lorene nodded, produced her driver's license. Elridge took it, examined it longer than necessary, then placed it beside the keyboard. More typing, then a pause. "I'll need an additional form of identification." Lorene tilted her head slightly. "I already gave you state-issued ID." Elridge didn't blink. "It's just a routine double-check. For bookings flagged with premium preferences." Lorene opened her bag, pulled out a second ID. This one was a corporate credential tied to an international investment group. Elridge examined it with a thin smile, placed it beside the first, then typed again. "Thank you. Please take a seat while we finish up. Shouldn't be long." Lorene glanced at the screen. Nothing was wrong. No alert. No mismatch. But she nodded once, took her documents back, and stepped away. The lounge chairs were plush, near a faux fireplace. She sat near the edge, legs crossed at the knee, posture straight. A moment later, a couple walked in behind her. White mid-50s, tennis clothes, laughter still in their throats from a joke just told. They stepped up to Elridge, who greeted them like returning royalty. Room keys, voucher, wine suggestions. No ID requested. No waiting. Lorene leaned back just slightly. She didn't touch her phone. She didn't sigh. She just watched. Elridge picked up a phone at her desk, turned slightly to whisper into it. Her eyes flicked over to where Lorene sat. Not once, 3 times. The tone was hushed, but the shape of her mouth was easy to read. Still here. She's still here. One of the doormen walked by and looked at Lorene. His eyes narrowed, then looked away. Another man, possibly a manager, emerged from a hallway behind the reception, spoke with Elridge in a hushed exchange, then turned his eyes toward Lorene. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply watched. Lorene met his eyes and held them. She could feel the weight of their wondering. Who is she? Why is she here? Does she belong here? She folded her hands over one knee. A group of guests passed by behind her, one of them laughing a little too loud, a fluted glass of champagne in her hand. The sound bounced across the tiles. Time passed. No one approached her. The clock above the fireplace ticked just off beat. She caught a bellboy glancing her way. He whispered something to another. The other laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't crude. But she knew that laugh. She had lived enough lives to know exactly what it meant. She stood up, walked to a table, poured herself a glass of cucumber water. She took a sip, turned slightly, and scanned the lobby. She noted the positions of every employee, every camera, every corridor. She returned to her seat. This was not the first time. Conversations floated lightly above the grand piano music that hummed from the overhead speakers. But beneath that polished ambience pulsed something sharper. She noticed the way the concierge continued to glance her way, the subtle shake of his head when another staff member approached and gestured toward her. She was no stranger to these moments, to the peculiar choreography of polite delay. It always began this way. Someone pretends to double-check something already known. Someone else whispers. Then there's a request, a strange, selective request. Elridge called her back to the counter with a new composure in her stance. Her smile stretched wider than before, but more hollow. Lorene rose and walked with the same calm she had arrived with, though her senses were now tuned like wires stretched tight. As she approached, Elridge leaned in ever so slightly and said, "Miss Vance, thank you for your patience, but we're going to need one more form of documentation." Lorene didn't blink. She leaned forward and said in a voice soft and flat, "I've already provided both a driver's license and federal ID tied to the reservation. What exactly do you think is missing?" Elridge straightened and replied, "It's just standard policy for high-tier bookings when certain verification flags are triggered. It's for your protection as well." Lorene's expression didn't change. She knew those words, heard them before. Every syllable was rehearsed, chosen to sound helpful while serving a different purpose. Behind the desk, another employee stepped closer, his ID tag reading Keaton. He didn't address her. Instead, he leaned toward Elridge, whispered something, then chuckled under his breath. Elridge's shoulders dropped slightly, and her mouth twitched in amusement. The kind of amusement people share when they think you can't possibly understand the joke. Lorene set her bag on the edge of the desk, unzipped a side pocket, and removed a slim black folio. From it, she retrieved a platinum concierge card issued directly from the brand's parent corporation. She handed it over, her eyes never leaving Elridge's face. The card glinted under the lobby lights, its engraving subtle, its weight unmistakable. Elridge took it without comment, her fingers tightening as she scanned it and frowned ever so slightly. This should have been the moment the entire charade dissolved. But instead, Elridge placed the card down and said, "Thank you. If you don't mind, we'll just take a few more minutes to confirm internal alignment with the reservation details. Please have a seat while we work that through." Lorene remained still for a second longer, then picked up the folio, tucked the card back inside, and returned to the lounge area. She sat with a stillness that wasn't passive, it was intentional, calculated. Her gaze shifted across the lobby, scanning details that others would ignore. A server approached a guest with complimentary champagne. Another staff member walked past her twice, each time looking her way without greeting her. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was now performance. 2 more guests entered the lobby, laughing loudly as they passed the front desk. A bellboy immediately rushed to greet them, offering to take their bags, ushering them straight past the line. Lorene noticed a faint hesitation in Elridge's movements now. Something had shifted, but not in the way that mattered. Keaton was back beside her again, talking in lower tones. Elridge nodded along, but her eyes kept glancing toward the screen. Lorene had seen this pattern before. When people start trying to find a reason to stall you, it's often because they already crossed a line they can't walk back from. The man in the khaki blazer from earlier returned to the desk, now with a complaint about the view from his room. Elridge was all warmth again, full of apologies and assurances. When she offered him a new suite on the upper floor, he smiled broadly and clapped the counter with exaggerated approval. Lorene watched the transaction unfold like a study in contrast. One woman seated, waiting. Another man elevated with ease. Her eyes narrowed, not with frustration, but with focus. Across the room, a staff member in a navy blazer emerged from a hallway behind the lobby, holding a clipboard. He scanned the area, whispered something into his earpiece, then walked behind the desk and showed Elridge the sheet. Elridge nodded, wrote something on the screen, then looked up again, this time avoiding Lorene's gaze entirely. That avoidance said everything. Lorene reached into her pocket and retrieved her phone. She typed quickly, thumbs moving with precision. The message was short, direct, sent to a contact labeled only as H. She placed the phone face down on the table beside her and waited. Keaton walked out from behind the desk with a small device in hand, approaching a couple seated near Lorene with complimentary, sparkling water. He spoke to them with the casual ease of someone who believed they were the right kind of people. Lorene's presence, nearby, composed, watching, seemed to be an irritant more than anything else. Keaton didn't acknowledge her, not even a nod. He simply walked past her again, taking his time, making a point. She let him. That kind of confidence always made people careless. Elridge returned to the counter and began assisting a new guest who had just arrived. Lorene heard her mention room upgrades and special executive-level privileges. No ID checks. No delays. The screen blinked once as Elridge confirmed the guest suite. As the woman walked away, Elridge caught sight of Lorene once more. This time, her smile faltered. Just for a moment. The smiles exchanged between staff and select guests had a rhythm to them. Quick, easy, unburdened. When their gazes passed over her, they slowed, hesitated, recalibrated. She watched every movement, noting not just what people did, but how they did it and who they did it for. Across the lobby, two hotel employees stood partially shielded behind a marble pillar near the bell desk. One of them, a young man with slicked back hair and a lapel pin shaped like a hawk, leaned in toward his colleague. His voice was low, but not low enough. "You think she's really staying here?" he asked, a smirk forming. "I've seen this before. Some of them just dress the part, walking confident, then get loud when they realize they don't belong." His co-worker laughed, not even attempting to hide it. The laugh was short, but sharp, the kind that wanted to be heard. Lorene turned her head slightly in their direction, not out of shock, not even anger, just confirmation. The sound of their amusement filled the space between her and the front desk like smoke. She met the hawk-pinned man's eyes for a brief second. He didn't flinch. If anything, he held her gaze with a brazen casualness that said he expected her to walk away. She didn't. Instead, she uncrossed her legs slowly, stood, and smoothed the front of her blazer. The bar stood in the far right corner of the lobby, tucked beneath an arch of dark wood and gold trim. The lighting was warm, the counter backlit by bottles of imported spirits arranged like a skyline. As Lorene approached, she saw 3 open seats at the bar. She chose the one closest to the center, rested one hand lightly on the brass rail, and waited. The bartender, a tall, clean-cut man with rolled sleeves and a name tag that read Bryce, glanced her way for a half second before turning to a couple who had just walked up behind her. They were white, mid-30s, dressed in tennis casual. Bryce beamed, welcomed them warmly, asked if they were here for the conference or just passing through. The woman laughed and said both. He nodded and began preparing their drinks, without so much as a glance toward Lorene. She waited, counted the seconds. 32 before Bryce finished their order. He handed them 2 gin and tonics with a flourish and said, "First one's on the house if you're staying with us." They smiled and thanked him. Lorene made no move to interrupt. She remained in place, her presence firm, her silence deliberate. Bryce finally turned her way. His smile faded slightly, replaced by something more neutral. He leaned forward with an arched brow. "You with the event?" he asked, voice more cautious now. No greeting, no menu, no question of preference, just a presumption of context. Lorene's reply was clear. "No, I'm a guest. I'm waiting for my suite. I'd like a still water." Bryce blinked, nodded, and without a word, turned to the fridge. His shoulders moved slower now, more hesitant. The energy behind his earlier flourish was gone. He poured the water, set it in front of her without a coaster, and moved on to restock glassware without comment. Lorene sipped. The water was cold, refreshing, but it tasted like defiance. Around her, the bar filled with more guests. She watched as Bryce greeted a man in a golf polo with a friendly slap on the shoulder, served a woman in heels with detailed explanations about local wines, offered a tasting sample to a couple debating bourbon. No one else drank in silence. No one else was served like a formality. The discrepancy wasn't in the drink, it was in the delivery. Behind her, the staffers who had laughed earlier walked past again. One of them, Hawkpin, whispered, "Looks like she's still trying." His voice was quieter this time, but not enough to be respectful. Lorene didn't turn. She didn't react. But inside, the ledger was growing. Each glance, each delay, each careless comment was recorded with surgical clarity. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. It was a battlefield she'd crossed before. What changed now was the terrain. She wasn't here to prove herself. She wasn't here to belong. She was here to watch them disqualify themselves. A woman in a gray skirt suit took the seat next to her, ordered a martini, and received it before Lorene had finished her water. Bryce asked the woman where she was from, whether she needed recommendations for dinner. He didn't speak to Lorene again. She placed the glass down gently, wiped condensation from her fingertips, and stood. As she walked away, she heard the bartender mutter something to the woman beside him. The word was low, but she caught it. Entitled. Not loud, not cruel, but clear. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. Near the elevators, a man in a navy blazer with a clipboard waited, with eyes scanning the room. She noticed his glance slide over her and settle on a pair of guests near the concierge. He adjusted his tie, walked past her without acknowledgement. He was there for someone, not her, not yet. Back at the seating area, Lorene retrieved her phone and checked the screen. A reply had come in, short, precise. Understood. Will escalate silently. She locked the phone, slid it back into her pocket, and returned to her seat. Her stillness was no longer invisible. It was threatening in its own quiet way, like a question left unanswered for too long. Behind the front desk, Elridge was joined by a man in a charcoal suit with a pressed collar and an expression carved in restrained authority. His name tag read R. Kessler, Assistant Front Office Manager. He walked with a measured confidence, every step calculated for optics, not speed. He didn't greet Lorene. He didn't nod. Instead, he motioned for Elridge to bring up the reservation file again. She complied with a few keystrokes, and the glow of the monitor lit up his face. Kessler squinted at the screen, as if what he saw required interpretation beyond mere facts. He leaned forward, gestured toward a line of data, and began muttering something inaudible, though Lorene could read his lips clearly enough. Wrong date. Are you sure this is confirmed? Elridge nodded, her fingers tapping as she brought up secondary confirmation logs. Lorene saw the rhythm change, Elridge moving more cautiously now, uncertain. Kessler folded his arms, took a deep breath, and stepped away from the screen. He approached Lorene slowly, posture formal but without warmth. He carried a slim leather folder under one arm, the kind used by managers who wanted their presence to feel more executive than functional. As he stopped in front of her, his tone was low, polite on the surface, but with that slight hesitation that always preceded the word "unfortunately." He informed her that, based on preliminary system checks, It appeared her reservation had been modified. Possibly a date discrepancy. Maybe an accidental shift in the calendar. Nothing personal, just procedural. He opened the folder, flipped through 2 pages, and pointed to a line of text she couldn't see. According to this, your booking may be listed for tomorrow, he said. His words were smooth, practiced, the kind used to end discussions before they start. But Lorene knew better. She had confirmed the date 3 times prior to arrival. She had the digital receipt. She had the itinerary forwarded by her assistant, synced across 2 platforms, and a calendar that she designed herself. This wasn't an error. It was a tactic, one meant to introduce doubt, the kind that disorients people into giving up. Lorene calmly reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and brought up the confirmation email. She handed the screen toward Kessler without rising, her gaze fixed steadily on his. He leaned in, read the clearly printed line, June 6th, check-in, Hayden Grand, Suite 1402. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He handed the phone back with a nod, then said they would need a few more minutes to verify alignment across their internal logs. She thanked him with a faint nod of her own and watched as he turned and walked back behind the desk, whispering again to Elridge. Their conversation grew more animated, though still subdued by the constraints of public hospitality. He tapped the screen harder this time, gesturing toward a different window. She watched as a 3rd staff member was called over, a young woman in a headset who opened another program and began typing furiously. A soft shift in the lobby's atmosphere pulled Lorene's attention to her right. A uniformed security guard had entered the space from the corridor near the service elevators. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a name tag that read Ortiz. He didn't speak. He didn't approach the desk. He walked past the concierge slowly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed ahead like someone pretending not to patrol. But when he reached Lorene's seating area, he stopped. Not beside her, not in front of her, behind her, close enough that she could hear the faint rasp of his radio static. He remained there, arms now folded, feet planted. His presence wasn't aggressive. It was strategic, a silent signal to the room, a kind of containment. No one said she was a problem, but now there was someone stationed nearby, just in case. Lorene didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge him, but she felt every inch of his posture, the weight of it pressing from behind, not enough to provoke, but just enough to remind. You're being watched. You're being handled. You're being contained in a box we hope you won't challenge. Across the room, the 2 staffers from earlier noticed the guard's placement. Hawkpin nudged his coworker and said something with a grin. The other snorted into his sleeve. Lorene heard none of it, but she knew. People like them always felt emboldened when systems validated their bias. The bar area had shifted too. Bryce continued his charm routine, but he glanced over toward the security presence more often now, his mood slightly more alert, as if awaiting escalation. He didn't make another comment. Not yet. But his glances were louder than words. Kessler remained behind the desk, now deep in conversation with the woman in the headset. She nodded, frowned, then nodded again, typing faster. Elridge stepped away from her station and walked over to the manager's podium near the entry. She pulled out a binder, flipped through a series of laminated pages, then paused. She tapped a section, called Kessler over. They reviewed something together, whispering now, lips tight. Lorene tapped her heel once against the carpet, a subtle reminder to herself that stillness did not mean surrender. She was not here for confrontation, but she wasn't here for compliance either. Her phone buzzed gently on the armrest beside her. Another message. New contact this time. D status noted. Recalibrating entry points. Hold position. She responded with one word. Received. Behind her, Ortiz shifted his weight. His boots made a soft thud against the floor, just loud enough to be noticed. A guest entering the lobby paused, looked toward him, then continued toward the elevators. Everything about the lobby remained functional, elegant, efficient, but now it vibrated with a current of controlled discomfort. Lorene had changed nothing. She had raised no voice, caused no disruption, and yet a wall had begun to form around her, made of delay, suspicion, suggestion. Each person involved now participated in a ritual of polite rejection, a carefully choreographed effort to maintain authority without confrontation. But authority built on falsehood always cracked under weight. Every movement was registered. Every shift in tone, every hushed exchange, every glance not meant for her, but clearly about her. Ortiz, the security guard, continued to stand behind her in silence, a static figure draped in authority, without explanation. Kessler and Elridge continued their hushed administrative theater behind the desk, occasionally peering up from a screen, as if waiting for something unseen to validate a decision already made. Then, without warning, a man in a sharp checkered blazer and loafers clicked past the check-in desk, clearly a guest, confident gait, the air of someone familiar with these spaces. He slowed, leaned in slightly toward Elridge, his voice low, but intentionally loud enough to be overheard by those nearby. The corners of his mouth pulled into a sly grin. He tilted his head toward Lorraine's direction and muttered something she couldn't make out fully, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A sentence dressed in mock concern. Elridge chuckled politely, the kind of practiced laugh that conceals more than it reveals. The man straightened, looked toward Lorraine, and laughed out loud. Not at something funny, but in that specific, public tone that seeks to claim dominance without being held accountable. "You sure she can actually afford a room here?" The words were thrown into the open space like a challenge. Not directed at Lorraine, not officially, but he made sure she heard them. So did others. Heads turned. A few smiles flickered. One woman standing near the elevator tightened her grip on her purse. A man at the concierge desk turned away quickly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. No one spoke. No one stopped him. Lorraine didn't flinch. She didn't look at him. She simply shifted her legs slightly, recrossed them, and let the weight of silence speak louder than any reaction could. But even silence had limits. Moments later, Ortiz took a step forward, his boots landing with deliberate heaviness on the plush rug. His voice, when it came, was level and official, practiced like a line from a script. He asked if he could inspect her luggage for verification purposes. "Random procedure," he said. "Security protocol. Nothing personal." She turned slowly and looked up at him. There was no question in her expression, only calculation. She had seen these tactics used before, selective enforcement, masked as neutrality. Behind her, other guests walked by freely, their bags untouched, their names unspoken. No one else had been asked. No one else had been flagged. No one else had been isolated under the pretense of compliance. Lorraine stood with quiet precision, picked up her leather overnight case, and placed it on the marble bench beside her. Ortiz reached for it without hesitation, opening it methodically, hands gloved and movements rehearsed. The zipper peeled open with a sharp metallic hiss, cutting through the lobby's polite atmosphere. He rummaged through the contents with clinical carelessness, pulling out her tablet, her documents, her cosmetics case, her tailored blazer folded in military precision. He examined each item without context, as if hunting for something incriminating in a perfectly legal space. As he worked, Elridge glanced over briefly, then looked away again. Kessler returned to the back room, not wanting to be visible during the scene. Two guests waiting in line stared openly, one whispering something under their breath. Another guest took a photo, pretending to text, but angling the camera ever so slightly in Lorraine's direction. Lorraine saw it, filed it, didn't react. Ortiz found nothing. Of course he found nothing. But instead of offering an apology, he zipped the bag closed and nodded, his tone as robotic as ever. "You're clear. Thank you for your cooperation." He said it as if she had volunteered, as if this had been her idea. Then he stepped back, returning to his silent post, as though nothing had happened. Lorraine calmly picked up her case and resumed her seat, her hands folded once again over her lap. The bag sat beside her untouched. She didn't adjust her clothes. She didn't fix her hair. She didn't shift uncomfortably. She sat perfectly still, letting every eye in the lobby reconcile what they had just witnessed. The woman in the elevator line turned away. The man who had laughed no longer smirked. He avoided her gaze now, perhaps realizing the line he had crossed was deeper than he thought. Back behind the desk, Elridge received a call. She answered it quickly, listened, then hung up without speaking. Her face paled slightly, her fingers tapping an erratic beat against the counter. Kessler returned from the hallway, holding a different binder now. He didn't walk as confidently. His steps were slower, more hesitant. He spoke to Elridge in a tone Lorene couldn't hear, but his posture was less rigid, more concerned. Ortiz checked his earpiece, nodded once, and moved away from Lorene's position, retreating toward the service corridor from which he came. The shift was subtle, but definitive. The performance was ending. Something had changed. Lorene sat unmoving, her eyes tracing the mirrored marble columns, her fingers gently resting on the leather handle of her overnight case. Each second that passed was no longer a delay, it was data. They had tested the edge of how far they could go, and now they hovered, uncertain whether to continue pushing or retreat. From behind the reception desk, Elridge was no longer laughing. Her voice had lowered into quick, clipped sentences exchanged with Kessler, who now carried a laptop instead of a clipboard. The screen angled away from the public eye. He was scrolling furiously, tapping and swiping with visible urgency. Elridge leaned over, whispered something that made him shake his head. Whatever she had told him didn't match what he was seeing. He looked up once, briefly, toward Lorene, then back at the screen. He walked off toward the back office without explanation, leaving Elridge alone at the desk. Moments later, another staff member emerged. A man in his late 30s with a red tie, nameplate reading D. Holtz, Senior Guest Coordinator. He smiled as he approached, but it was the smile of someone who had been called in to fix something uncomfortable rather than truly assist. He held no tablet, no laptop, no folder, just his own practiced professionalism. He stopped a few feet from Lorene and cleared his throat lightly, just enough to draw her attention. He apologized for the ongoing confusion and explained that the team had done a full search of the system and, regrettably, found no trace of her reservation. Lorene's response was calm. She reached into her folio, pulled out a printed confirmation, and handed it to him. The paper was crisp, the logo embossed, the dates highlighted, the booking number clear. Holtz took it with both hands, examined it carefully, and blinked twice before lifting his gaze to meet hers. He nodded, acknowledged the document, and excused himself to check the offline database. As he walked back toward the desk, he didn't hand the confirmation to Elridge. He kept it in his hand, looked around, and then made his way directly to a locked terminal near the side office. As Holtz disappeared behind a frosted glass door, another employee approached the front desk. Young, sharply dressed, with a name tag that read Tyler. He looked like someone still new enough to believe everything was about procedures and not prejudice. He spoke to Elridge in a low voice, glancing toward Lorene only once. Whatever was said, Elridge nodded, leaned toward him, and whispered something with a barely concealed sneer. He didn't laugh. He just looked down, took a breath, and walked toward the far side of the counter. But instead of returning to work, Tyler paused. He hesitated as he neared the concierge desk, then circled back slowly, hands behind his back. As he passed near Lorene, he leaned slightly toward her, not enough to draw attention, just enough to ensure she heard him. His voice was almost a whisper. "Look, I don't mean anything by it," he said softly, not meeting her eyes. "But maybe this just isn't the kind of place that works for everyone. There are other hotels. You might be more comfortable somewhere else." He said it with a strange mixture of false empathy and deep discomfort, as if trying to convince himself he was doing her a favor. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away quickly, his shoulders stiff, his jaw clenched like someone who had just followed a bad order, but didn't have the courage to question it. Lorene didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply looked back toward the desk, where Holtz had gone. The glass door remained closed. The clock on the wall ticked one more minute into irrelevance. Guests continued to pass through the lobby, some now purposefully avoiding her section, others pretending not to see her at all. A couple approached the check-in desk and were immediately welcomed with warmth and efficiency. Within 2 minutes, They had their room keys and an offer for complimentary spa services. No one had welcomed Lorene. No one had even offered her a seat until she found it herself. At the bar, Bryce was now quieter, more mechanical in his tone. He glanced over every few moments, but quickly looked away when Lorene caught his eye. Whatever performance had been maintained earlier was dissolving into thinly veiled uncertainty. People were beginning to sense that the narrative was breaking down. Then the frosted door opened. Holtz emerged, holding her printed confirmation in one hand and his phone in the other. He was no longer smiling. His steps were slower, more deliberate, and he walked directly to the back of the counter, placed the confirmation on the desk, and began typing. Elridge leaned in to speak with him, but he held up one hand, halting her mid-sentence. He didn't speak to her. He didn't speak to Tyler. He simply typed, checked, retyped. From her seat, Lorene could see their postures shift. Elridge crossed her arms. Tyler stepped away completely. Holtz pressed a final key, looked up, and frowned. He stepped around the desk again, approached Lorene, and said that while the printed confirmation was indeed legitimate, it did not match any entry in their live booking system. As a result, and given the sensitive nature of executive reservations, they would require her to wait until corporate could be reached for further clarification. The front desk, which had once been the center of orchestrated exclusion, now buzzed with anxiety masked by protocol. Holtz spoke quietly on the phone, his expression tight, the confirmation page trembling slightly in his grip. Elridge remained near the terminal, her arms now uncrossed, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the desk. Behind them, the frosted glass door to the operations room stood ajar, a single sliver of fluorescent light illuminating part of the floor. No one laughed anymore. The jokes had dried up. The rhythm had broken. Lorene's phone buzzed once on the table beside her, the screen lighting up with a soft, glowing name. H. She picked it up, pressed the side button to silence it, and then held it in her palm. Without looking around, without raising her voice, she stood up slowly and walked toward the far corner of the lobby, where a tall privacy partition created a quiet alcove beside an indoor water feature. Her heels echoed against the marble, drawing attention without effort. She reached the corner, lifted the phone, and placed a single call. Her voice, low and measured, carried just enough weight to silence the air around her. "This is Walker. Activate board protocol. I'm flagging location 17, non-compliance, system breach, live discrimination markers. Initiate live alert. Full visibility." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a brief reply. Then she ended the call and returned to her seat. No dramatic gestures, no accusations, no declarations of power, just a single act, a ripple that would soon become a wave. At the front desk, Holtz hung up his call just seconds after Lorene had ended hers. His eyes widened slightly as he glanced at the screen in front of him. Something had changed. He leaned forward, whispered something to Elridge. She looked up, alarmed, and immediately clicked into the same system. As the seconds passed, their faces began to shift, not with confusion this time, but with recognition. Behind them, Tyler reappeared from the staff corridor, holding a clipboard. He started to speak, but Holtz cut him off with a wave of his hand. Tyler froze, his mouth still slightly open, before stepping back without another word. Elridge, pale now, turned toward the lobby just in time to see a black vehicle roll up outside the glass entrance. It wasn't flashy, but it moved with intention. A uniformed valet ran toward it before being waved off by the driver, who exited and circled to open the passenger door. From within stepped a man in a dark gray suit, tall and direct in movement, carrying nothing but a sleek leather tablet case. His presence was immediate. Every staff member within view instinctively straightened their posture. He entered the lobby with purpose, bypassing the concierge, the bar, and every guest in between. He walked directly toward Lorene, stopped 2 feet in front of her, and inclined his head in a gesture that spoke of apology without hesitation. "Ms. Walker, I received your call. On behalf of the company, I offer our sincerest regrets for the mishandling of your experience. I am fully briefed and empowered to resolve this immediately." His voice wasn't performative. It carried weight because it needed no performance. The silence that followed was suffocating. Holtz looked as if the air had left his lungs. Elridge's lips parted, but no sound came out. Tyler took one step back and dropped the clipboard. No one moved to pick it up. Bryce at the bar stared openly now, his towel frozen mid-wipe over a wine glass. Ortiz, the security guard, stood near the rear wall, visibly stunned, his gaze darting between Lorene and the suited man like someone realizing they had misread the entire scene. The man continued, pulling out a folded page from his tablet case and handing it to Lorene. A priority access directive with executive override, signed and timestamped. Attached was a memo from the board, her board. She took it without expression, folded it once, and placed it into her folio. She nodded once, then gestured subtly toward the front desk. He understood. He turned to Holtz and said, "Full access. Immediate key issue. Authorization Walker Tier 1. You'll notify Central Compliance and archive today's footage for legal review. Ms. Walker will determine next actions." Holtz nodded shakily. He tried to respond, but could only manage a strangled "understood." Elridge stepped forward, attempted to speak, but all she could form was, "Ms. Walker, we didn't," then trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced now by the realization that every small decision she had made, the delays, the smirks, the extra ID request, had been recorded by someone far more powerful than she had imagined. From the corner of the lobby, the same man in the checkered blazer who had mocked Lorene earlier now stood frozen in place. He was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, visibly paling as he realized just how wrong he had been. Lorene rose once more, this time slowly, deliberately. She adjusted her blazer with one hand and picked up her bag. The man in the suit handed her the room key, Suite 1402, as originally booked. No more verification. No more delays. No more resistance. His hands hovered above the keyboard but did not type. Elridge remained still, her posture no longer stiff with control but slack with recognition of just how far she had misstepped. The clipboard Tyler had dropped was still lying on the floor, forgotten. And across the room, guests had begun whispering. A couple at the bar leaned toward each other, murmuring beneath their breath. A man seated in the lounge discreetly turned his phone camera toward the front desk, capturing the staff's confused panic. The regional director who had addressed Lorene, now fully aware of the tremor she had sent through the corporate ranks, remained by the front desk, issuing quiet instructions to the staff. His phone buzzed, and he lifted it to his ear, speaking in a hushed tone. The phrase "internal audit" was barely audible as he turned away to shield his voice. Meanwhile, Elridge's terminal chimed with a soft ping. A push notification appeared on the upper corner of her screen, flagged from the company's communications app. The header read, "Who is Natalie Walker? The billionaire force reshaping American hospitality." Her hand hovered over the mouse before clicking the article. The image loaded instantly. A full-color profile photo of Lorene, Natalie Walker in her official identity, standing in front of a luxury resort property with a headline beneath in bold gold lettering. The subtext read, "From policy intern to CEO, the woman behind the $1.6 billion hospitality empire." Elridge gasped audibly. She turned her monitor slightly, and Holtz leaned in, eyes narrowing as he read the opening paragraph. It detailed Walker's journey from a policy analyst in urban development to the acquisition and transformation of a dozen failing hotel chains into a single, unified luxury brand operating in 22 countries. It mentioned that she maintained direct oversight of executive integrity audits and personally reviewed select complaints sent to corporate. And most damning of all, it listed the Hayden Grand as one of her flagship properties. Tyler stepped forward, reading over Elridge's shoulder, his mouth slowly falling open. Ortiz, still standing nearby, shifted his weight, clearly realizing the full scope of what had just happened. Within minutes, staff phones began lighting up. Push notifications from hotel industry newsletters, social media alerts, and even local news updates all featured the same headline, the same image, the same undeniable truth. The woman they had mocked, stalled, questioned, dismissed, searched, and whispered about wasn't just a guest. She was the owner. Holt slowly straightened his tie, his throat visibly tightening. He took a deep breath and turned toward the internal camera monitor behind the counter. The screen showed a feed from the elevator interior. Natalie stood alone, motionless, her posture serene, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. She was calm, too calm. Holtz muttered softly to himself, "We're going to be on every compliance report for the next 5 years." Just as the elevator reached the top floor, a sound broke the quiet. High heels clicking briskly against the marble. The regional director had returned from his call, his demeanor now sharpened to surgical precision. He instructed all senior staff to gather immediately in the side conference room. No questions, no objections. Elridge and Holtz exchanged glances. Tyler stepped away from the terminal. Ortiz looked toward the security booth but did not move. Before anyone could speak, the director raised a hand and addressed the group. "She's not just the owner. She's the board." The words landed like a gavel. Final. Unarguable. Meanwhile, inside the elevator, Natalie reached into her handbag and retrieved a small, matte black leather wallet. As the doors opened, she stepped into the penthouse corridor without hesitation, paused, and removed a card from the case. It was weighty, metallic, embossed with a single line of gold text, Walker International Tier 1 Executive Access. No title, no department, no expiry, just authority. Back in the lobby, a flustered assistant manager from accounting entered with a manila folder in hand, whispering that the system had received a directive from corporate to flag all incident reports matching the guest profile within the past 90 minutes. Holtz took the folder, scanned the sheet inside, and paled. There were at least 6 recorded breaches of policy attached to Natalie's interaction, each one log timestamped, and now categorized under escalated misconduct. Elridge tried to excuse herself, citing a scheduling error, but the regional director waved her down and told her to wait for HR's directive. Bryce at the bar retreated into the back room, suddenly remembering tasks he had forgotten. Even Ortiz, who had once stood tall with assumed authority, now remained by the door, hoping he would not be summoned. 10 minutes passed before the director's phone buzzed again. He picked it up, listened, nodded, and turned to the desk. "She's requested a meeting," he said. "Not a confrontation, a briefing." Holtz asked, "With whom?" "Everyone who had a role in this," the director answered. The silence that followed was deafening. Upstairs, in Suite 1402, Natalie placed the access card on the table beside a bottle of chilled water. She sat on the edge of the velvet chaise lounge, pulled out her tablet, and opened a secure portal into the company's live staff records. A soft chime indicated that all front desk terminals had entered compliance review lockout. In Suite 1402, the atmosphere was as quiet as it was commanding. Natalie Walker sat composed in the high-back leather chair at the end of the executive conference table, a digital tablet in her hand and the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her framing the skyline like a portrait of poised dominion. Across the room, her executive liaison was finalizing a compliance upload to the internal server, syncing all relevant incident logs, timestamps, and personnel metadata into a secure review portal. Everything was happening in real time, and the walls that had once protected incompetence were now made of glass. Natalie didn't have to raise her voice or issue ultimatums. The machine she had built, the system they had underestimated, was doing it for her. Downstairs, the side conference room adjacent to the main lobby was no longer a room for internal updates and scripted hospitality workshops. It had become a holding area for accountability. Holtz, Elridge, Tyler, and 2 other mid-level managers sat in silence, their employee badges removed, their work tablets confiscated, and their phones restricted to local access. The regional director remained standing at the front of the room, reading from a printed directive stamped with the signature of the corporate disciplinary board. The order was clear: temporary suspension pending formal review. No negotiations, no delays. Each staff member was to be escorted off premises once their initial debriefing concluded, and none would be permitted to return until the audit was closed. The director read the line again to be certain they understood, Failure to comply with equitable guest policy in a leadership capacity constitutes a Tier 3 violation, subject to contract reevaluation and permanent dismissal. Holt sat stone-faced, his career unraveling in milliseconds. Elridge, visibly trembling now, stared down at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Tyler, younger and newer, looked less guilty and more shattered, realizing too late that silence was a form of action, and he had chosen it when it mattered most. Upstairs, Natalie reviewed the compliance logs one last time before issuing the command to initiate the second phase. The message was transmitted to the company's global communication server. It carried a single attachment, an encrypted audio file extracted from the lobby's surveillance system, marked with a digital watermark that proved its origin. The file was raw. No edits. No manipulation. Just truth. The voices were clear, Elridge requesting multiple forms of ID without cause, Keaton laughing with remarks like some of them like to pretend they belong, the sneering guest suggesting she can't possibly afford a place like this. Even Ortiz, the security officer, was captured justifying the search of her luggage, as standard when they get confrontational. It wasn't just unprofessional. It was prejudicial, systemic, and undeniable. Natalie uploaded the file to the internal HR system, but simultaneously, she authorized a third-party compliance partner to leak it anonymously to a verified hospitality watchdog account on social media. The post went live at 4:37 p.m. By 4:42 p.m., it had been viewed over 22,000 times. By 5 p.m., 3 major hospitality publications had reposted it with the caption, "This is what racial profiling looks like behind a 5-star smile." At the front desk, the new shift manager, called in urgently from a nearby branch, tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. Guests continued checking in, albeit now with a tension that clung to the air like humidity. Several looked around nervously, whispering to each other. One guest asked if the woman in the article was still in the hotel. The manager nodded, offering no further comment. Staff morale had sunk below the floor. Calls from other departments flooded in, PR requests, executive office pings, legal inquiries. The hotel's name was now trending, and not for its luxury brunch offerings. By 5:23 p.m., Hayden Grand Corporate released a preliminary statement acknowledging the incident and confirming that disciplinary action had already been taken. They did not name the employees involved, but the internet had already done the work. Screenshots, LinkedIn profiles, and years-old tweets surfaced. The staff members were no longer unknown faces behind a desk. They were now part of a global conversation about bias in elite service industries. In the lounge, the man in the checkered blazer, who had openly mocked Natalie earlier, scrolled through his phone, watching the video clip with a pale face and a clenched jaw. He stood and walked toward the front desk, attempting to ask a question, but the new manager raised a hand and said firmly, "Sir, we're limiting non-essential inquiries at this time." He returned to his seat, defeated not by policy, but by shame. Back in the conference room, the regional director was now taking individual statements. Elridge struggled to defend her actions, blaming system glitches and misinterpreted protocol. Holtz attempted a more strategic defense, stating that executive bookings sometimes trigger additional verification under specific data flags. But the director interrupted, reading from the system logs. There was no data flag. She had a clean record, priority override, and brand-level clearance. You chose to ignore it. Tyler simply said, "I thought it wasn't my place to question senior staff." The director looked at him for a moment and replied, "Inaction isn't neutral. It's just quiet participation." In the weeks following the incident, the ripple effects spread far beyond the marble floors of a Hayden Grand. Natalie Walker's quiet defiance had detonated into a movement, one that traveled through boardrooms, training manuals, review systems, and every layer of corporate hospitality infrastructure. Headlines faded, but the memory did not. Investigations were completed. Contracts were dissolved. Policies were rewritten. But what lingered wasn't just change in structure. It was change in people. Beneath the surface of a polished industry, something deeper had been stirred awake. Elridge, the receptionist, who had once smirked through prejudice masked as professionalism, found herself dismissed with cause after the internal audit. Her termination letter cited misconduct and breach of guest equity policy. But what followed that dismissal was not silence. It was the beginning of her reckoning. For months, she avoided the spotlight, shut down her social accounts, and withdrew from her professional network. But the memory of what she had done and who she had become under the comfort of unchecked bias haunted her. She couldn't escape it. Late at night, she replayed the footage. She listened to her own voice denying access, smirking through cruelty. She saw herself not as the woman in the uniform, but as a warning. In a quiet moment of clarity, she reached out, not through legal channels, not for damage control, but through a handwritten letter sent to Walker International Headquarters. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't a justification. It was raw. I didn't know how far I had gone until I saw myself in your silence. I was following what others told me was normal, but now I know it was never normal. It was small, and I was small inside it. Please know I am trying to change. I don't expect forgiveness, just truth. Natalie received the letter without comment, read it once, and placed it in a drawer marked private. She never responded, not directly, but the letter was not ignored. Nearly 1 year later, in a sunlit conference hall overlooking the Boston waterfront, Walker International hosted the first of its annual Inclusive Leadership Forums. It was a 2-day event with keynote speakers, interactive workshops, and private panels dedicated to the advancement of equity and cultural intelligence in global hospitality. The guest list was curated with intention, not just executives and trainers, but those who had once been part of the problem and now sought to become part of the solution. Among the attendees sat Elridge, no longer in uniform but present, her notebook full of scribbled questions and confessions. She listened to panelists speak not about punishment, but about awakening. She didn't ask for a photo. She didn't stand up to make herself seen. She simply listened. Next to her sat Tyler, now working as a diversity consultant for a smaller boutique hotel group. After his suspension, he had enrolled in a specialized training program offered through a scholarship quietly funded by the Walker Foundation. He had completed the program with distinction. He had volunteered at shelters, spoken at student panels, and now worked to rebuild trust where it had once been broken. On the stage stood Natalie, no notes, no teleprompter, just clarity. She spoke not of the hotel, not of that day, but of something larger, about the weight of first impressions, about the quiet power of dignity, about what happens when people stop defending their ignorance and start interrogating it. She told the room, change does not come when we get caught. Change begins when we choose to see. Her words did not accuse. They invited. Somewhere near the back of the room, a man in a tailored blazer, once the guest who had mocked her appearance at the Hayden Grand, sat with his hands folded, eyes lowered. He had reached out months prior, requesting a chance to speak with her. She hadn't responded, but she had made sure his name was on the invite list. He had been given no special access, no reserved seat, just a ticket and a choice. And now he sat there, silently carrying the weight of the moment he had once tried to laugh away. He didn't speak that day, but his presence was an admission. Sometimes that was enough to begin. After the session, Natalie walked through the reception area of the conference venue. A woman approached her, older, a former manager at the Hayden Grand. She held out a booklet with trembling hands, a guest training manual she had rewritten with her own money after being let go. She asked if Natalie would accept it, not as a gift, but as proof. Natalie accepted it, turned to the first page, and read the title, Hospitality Without Assumption. She nodded once, said nothing, and walked on. The conference ended with a private dinner, modest in scale, but intentional in tone. There were no fireworks, no standing ovations, just conversations, eye contact, accountability, and beneath it all, a sense that redemption, when earned, could be real. Later that night, in her suite overlooking the harbor, Natalie stood alone, the city glowing beyond the glass. The same silence that had once been used to suppress her had now become her signal. Not everything needed a headline. Not every story required revenge. Some victories were quiet. Some justice arrived not with punishment, but with awakening. The system hadn't changed because of her power. It had changed because she refused to let silence protect cruelty. She had watched, endured, and waited until the moment to act was no longer about defense, but about design. And now she was building something new, not just a brand, not just a legacy, but a culture, a standard. One built not on exclusion, but on presence. The end. If this story moved you, let us know by hitting the like button and subscribing for more powerful narratives just like it. What moments struck you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective.